All right, so since this is going to go online, I'm going to say, hey, y'all, we're from the South, right? My name's Sarah Bruton, and I'm the alternative school psychologist for Richland 2. And I would like to talk with y'all today about creating a school-to-society pipeline. I am the district's alternative school psychologist, and some of y'all may not know what a school psychologist does. I hear a lot from people when I tell them I do that, oh, we don't have one of those here. It's probably because you didn't need us, which is okay. That's great. But school psychologists are psychologists who are trained to work in teams in schools to support students' educational and mental health outcomes. I'm the alternative school psychologist because I work with our alternative programs, which are schools that are designed to provide a second chance at an education for students who are struggling with their behavior in their neighborhood school. I want to talk with y'all today about possibilities for creating a school-to-society pipeline because, unfortunately, right now in this country, data supports the existence of a school-to-prison pipeline. I want you to think about that, a school-to-prison pipeline. And there are many factors that go into creating this pipeline. But the idea is that when students are repeatedly involved in disciplinary action in the schools, they are at higher risk for becoming involved with the juvenile justice system. But the good news is that there are lots of evidence-based practices that I'm going to talk about today that we can use to develop a school-to-society pipeline. And I think this information is helpful for folks in schools, in the community, because we all want the best for our students. We want them to have better lives. We want to create a better society, and not just for our students, but also for our children at home. And this is my little Sean and Molly they referred to, my children at home. One of the most concerning aspects of the school-to-prison pipeline is the disproportionality that exists for students with disabilities and for students of minority status. So in the general student population, we might have a certain level of students with disabilities. But when we look at students identified for disciplinary action, that level is much higher. It's not what we would expect. It's disproportionate to the amount of students and disabilities in the general population. We see this disproportionality as well for students of minority status. In the general student population, you might have a certain percentage of students of minority status, but students identified for a disciplinary action are at a much higher level. Okay, so I have been doing this for a little while, and I have heard people say, Sarah, you can't save everyone. And honestly, at first it would make me a little angry because isn't that our purpose in schools is to try to help every child? But I've processed that because I'm a psychologist, so I've processed it. And my answer now is, you're right. I can't. But maybe we can do it together. I kind of compare it to an orchestra playing a symphony, and one of the reasons I do that is because I grew up playing the violin, and I still play the violin. And I'll be honest with y'all, when I go to a concert, I don't really expect to hit every single note. It's the truth, I don't. But what I do expect is that as an orchestra, we'll hit every single note, and we'll make a beautiful symphony together. And it's my hope that as teams in schools, that we can function similarly, that I may not be able to get to every single child, but that our team in the school will be able to get to every single child and make that child's life better, and together we can make society better. So I believe we all have the power to be the change in this effort and be a positive influence in the lives of those around you. And this is the character trait of citizenship that we teach in one of my alternative schools. I do believe we have a legal and ethical mandate to try to reroute the school-to-prison pipeline and instead create a school-to-society pipeline. But it's going to require perseverance, which is another character trait that we teach. These are big systems-level changes involving lots of people doing lots of work, and it's going to take time. But there is a legal mandate for this. If we look at special education law, we are mandated to educate students with disabilities in the least restrictive environment, which means we educate them as much as possible with students who are typically developing. And we try to keep them out of separate school settings like alternative schools. It also relies on the Civil Rights Law of 1964, which says that federal programs that receive federal funding have to treat minorities in an equitable manner. And they actually specifically mention school discipline in that law. This is an example of an evidence-based practice in my school. This is a little example. It's something you could take home and do in your classroom next week. It's a bulletin board that one of my teachers made. And it says, change your words, change your mindset. Well, some of y'all are probably thinking, how is this evidence-based? Well, as a psychologist, I know that when you change your words and you change your mindset, that's referring to cognitive behavioral theory, which is the idea that if we change our cognitions, we change our thoughts, we can also change our behaviors, our actions, and the way we feel about ourselves. And it's a strong evidence-based intervention for mental health issues. And so some of these thoughts are error thoughts that our students might come in with, but every day they walk down the hall of school and see another way to think about themselves. So one of the examples from the bulletin board is, I give up. And instead, we encourage them to think, I use some strategies that I learned. Another example is, I don't understand. Encourage them to instead think, well, what am I missing? The bulletin board is an example of a strategy that can fit into 3 different categories of evidence-based intervention that can be used to create a school-to-society pipeline. The first category is multi-tiered systems of support. The second category is expanded mental health services. And the third category is positive psychology practices. And these are all evidence-based interventions for creating a school-to-society pipeline. The bulletin board you saw might fall at the lowest tier of this multi-tiered systems of support. And tier 1 is meant to be universal instruction and supports. So these are evidence-based strategies that we think could help everyone. And our hope is that they will help most students. But students who don't respond at that level to the bulletin board or the character education class, or positive behavior interventions and supports, which is another multi-tiered model that allows schools to develop 3 to 5 values they want to support in their schools and point out the good in students instead of what they're doing wrong. And this is something that's really important for my students in the alternative schools who oftentimes have been punished many times. That positive reinforcement really makes a difference for them. But still, there are some students that don't respond at tier 1. So then we look at tier 2, which is targeted interventions. Why are those students still struggling even with the good tier 1 interventions? Maybe they need a social skills counseling group. And then students who struggle even in that smaller group might get an intense individual intervention, like individual counseling or family counseling, or a behavior plan, or maybe even a special education evaluation with someone like me. The second group of evidence-based practices for creating a school-to-society pipeline is expanded school mental health. And this is a poster from one of my alternative schools that indicates that in our schools we have a counseling requirement because we believe that students get in trouble and come to our school not just because they're a behavior problem, but because there's underlying issues that we need to support and treat. And so every child that comes to our schools has to complete a counseling requirement. Some of them do it through multifamily intervention groups, some of them do it through family counseling, some of them do it through individual counseling, or some combination, whatever we think is going to best meet their needs. Expanded school mental health refers to providing more of these supports in the schools and better utilizing the faculty that we have who are trained to provide these supports, like school psychologists, but also school social workers and also school counselors. And not only using the people in the schools to provide these supports, but allowing us time for collaboration with people outside of the schools, because many of our students go to see private therapists, and the best way to get good outcomes for our students is for us to talk to each other and everyone to be on the same page in supporting the student and the family. The third area of evidence-based intervention for creating school-to-society pipeline is positive psychology. And this is a poster from one of my schools, again, a tier 1 intervention our children see every day. One small positive thought in the morning can change your whole day. And the power of positivity, of looking at how people function at their best, is actually a relatively new idea in psychology. Traditionally, psychologists look at weaknesses. They look at what's wrong. But in this model, we're going to look at strengths. We're going to look at what that child is doing right, because that can tell you something. Every child is doing something right, and every family is doing something right. And how can we use those things to help children develop their weaknesses? Okay, so my colleague Jason Bird and I did a literature review on those areas of evidence-based practice for creating a school-to-society pipeline. And usually when you do that kind of literature review, you think about, well, where do we want to go in the future? And when I think about my work in schools, the people I work with the most are the students and the teachers. So I think, how could this help teachers? What can we do to help teachers with this research? And these are some of my friends that I work with, teachers I work with in my schools. And so when I look at these 3 areas of evidence-based practice, multi-tiered model, well, that could be used with teachers because oftentimes new teachers, brand new teachers come into school, they have no courses in behavior management. And at this point, national data suggests that 20% of children have a mental health condition. 20%. That's a regular classroom, not a special ed classroom. You walk in and 1 out of 5 of those children has a diagnosable mental health condition. So teachers really need to be equipped to handle all the different behaviors and needs that they're going to be faced with in their classroom. Teachers who don't respond to that basic classroom management training, maybe they go to support groups for each other and talk about particularly difficult children. And then tier 1, if they need high support, they might have some kind of individually designed plan. But all of that, I believe, should be presented in the context of positive psychology. Just like we want to tell students what they're doing right, it's very important to tell teachers what they're doing right, because I tell you what, teaching is a really hard job. And then the expanded school mental health aspect is where I think it's important to help teachers know where they can go to get resources to cope with all of the difficult things they're hearing. The standard for mental health practice right now is trauma-informed practice, and that's because children in this day and age have been exposed to trauma. A lot of them have. And the teachers are on the front lines. They're the ones that are hearing all the stories. So what do? Where do they go for help? How do they know when to get that child help? So I think that's how we can apply expanded school mental health to our work with teachers. And my hope is that when we apply this work to teachers, teachers will see the importance of applying this work to students, and will make these interventions even more effective for the students and even more likely to create a school-to-society pipeline. So to conclude, I want to share a quote that's between me and Ralph Waldo Emerson, maybe at together with friends. But the first part is Ralph. The secret in education lies in respecting the student. And I added, and the teacher. And for me, this really sums everything up, because all of these interventions, they're multi-level. They require a lot of effort. They require long-term commitments. And we're not going to get results unless we have respect for each other, unless we have trust, unless we have connectedness, unless we have caring. You have to have that foundation to try to do this kind of multi-level systems intervention. And I believe when we have that foundation and we add the evidence-based intervention on top of it, hopefully we can create a community that works, not just for some students and teachers, but for all of us.